you have this Tucker Carlson Putin interview. I gave it a shot last week. It's over 2 hours. Obviously, you have
It's a lot.
the translation. I already had heard beforehand, right? I had read that first question or so that Putin goes on this 30 to 35-minute history lesson. So I already knew that going in. So I'll just be honest to the viewers and listeners here. Once I started listening, I checked out 5, 10 minutes in. But then today, before we started recording, I did watch this 25-minute interview of Tucker at the World Government Summit, and he was asking questions or answering questions, most of them about the interview. So it was his opinion on the interview and what Putin said. So did you? You're telling me before we press record, it took you like 5 sessions to get through it. Is that right?
I yeah, I don't know why I watched the whole thing, but I did. I slugged my way through it. And you're right. It was funny because Carlson, asked, I think right away the most obvious question, which is a good question. Why did you invade Ukraine? And Putin's like, well, in the year 862, there was a
Yes.
Norwegian prince who came to the land of Rus. And I'm like, oh dear God, this it was absolutely hilarious. But you know what? One of the things I think is so interesting, and Carlson kind of played this up. Well, we don't hear from Putin, and what Western nobody interviews Putin. Well, first of all, the reason nobody interviews because as the Kremlin has said, they deny most of the interview requests. There's a reason they granted Tucker Carlson the request, and we all know what it is. They view him, I think, rightly as a Putin-friendly American media outlet, a person. But he's made these comments before. Like, if you've Vladimir Putin has used this historical justification, maybe not in this great of detail, but he's used this before. This has been widely reported before. So the idea that this is some new, maybe some people had never heard Putin before and they thought this was new. This was not new. This, and if you, I'm not going to get into the details because I don't even know all the details, but just Google fact checking Vladimir Putin's history. I mean, you will see that, let's just say historians disagree with some of his interpretations of how the world came to be, as it is now. But look, I have my critiques of the interview. I think Tucker Carlson did not. The only thing he really pressed him on was the Evan Gerskovich, the Wall Street Journal
Yeah,
reporter, which I thought
I saw
Carlson
that.
did a great job on that of really holding Putin's feet to the fire there. So I really and I thought it was a worthy interview. I'm glad he did it. I thought he did ask some good questions, but he didn't press Putin on any of the obvious things like the atrocities in Ukraine, the capturing of Ukrainian children allegedly, and kidnapping them to Russia, his own domestic politics, how he doesn't allow anyone really to criticize him. They go to prison, they end up dead, they end up poisoned. I mean, none of that like obvious stuff that you could ask Vladimir Putin about. Carlson, wasn't really interested in that. But at the end of the day, it goes back to there is this fascination, I will say, among the MAGA movement. I don't even know if I'd call it the right because I don't think it is in the tradition of conservatism, but it's certainly in the tradition of the MAGA movement. And Carlson's a part of this. And Trump's where they have this, I don't know if fawning's the right word, but this like level of respect for some of these dictators and thugs, Putin at the top of the list, and almost a bending over backwards to give their warped worldview the benefit of the doubt. When really, the reason Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine isn't because of what happened in 862. It was because he wanted that country to be controlled under a government that was sympathetic to Russia. And he didn't want that country to move into the sphere of the West, which is what clearly the Ukrainian people wanted, which is why they elected Zelensky and why they wanted to be part of the EU and part of NATO. It was about his own self-interest. It wasn't to save the Russian-speaking population in the southern part of the country. It was his own self-interest. He invaded another sovereign country, a democracy. That's why he did it. And the question for America isn't to get in the weeds of the history of, the 12th century. It's to decide what should be our reaction to that. And the Senate passed the bill yesterday, 70 to 29, that funded Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and their various fights. and also humanitarian aid for Gaza. That Biden supports it. We'll see if it will pass the House. I don't know if House Republicans will bring it up. There's clearly enough support in the House that it would pass if it came to the floor, and it should pass because at the end of the day, whatever you want to argue about the history of how Vladimir Putin perceives the world, he invaded a sovereign country that is a democracy and just decided to do it and wanted to control the country and now wants to take a large chunk of that country. And you either think that's a good idea and you think that's something that we should fight against by help, not by sending US troops, but by arming the Ukrainians, or you don't.
It's interesting because I wasn't going to go to this, but you brought up why folks on the right have this more sympathetic approach to Putin, and you said some other thugs or dictators, whatever, but specifically on Putin. When you said that, here's what I think of, and this is it's not like I'm the first person to say this, but what's the number one issue for Republicans that we've seen here in exit polling and primary? It's immigration. And let's be real, look at what's happened in the country, but also in the world with immigration in Europe. You can go back to Brexit. And look, this is a fair conversation to have. It is not racist to wonder what is the appropriate amount of immigration in any country. And I think that is part of the reason that there's a more sympathetic approach to Putin in Russia. It's those old school traditional values. I mean, we can talk about race as well, but basically an anti-immigration type country with Russia. And then so I also thought of this because Tucker Carlson brought this up in this talk at the World Government Summit. He said, "Look, one thing I noticed in Moscow was that all of their cities look look way better than our cities." Right? In terms of cleanliness, safety. He brought up the fact that in America, in some of these cities, you don't feel safe to ride public transit. And I think that all kind of wraps into what you were talking about with why there could be a more sympathetic approach to Putin and to Russia and countries that are anti-immigration. We know that the right, clearly wants a more secure border, and I agree with them than the left. But what do you think about that? Because I think that all plays into why there's more of a and religion, all these things that I think people on the right, a lot of people on the right, look at Russia and they see more of those old school conservative values. They feel like the United States is losing a lot of that.
Yeah, I think it's all it's an amorality that Donald Trump has. Like eh, Donald Trump, I don't think really has morals like a lot of us do. I think he's just all about the result and all what he perceives to be the best results. And that's not typically how America has functioned. We have made distinctions between countries where there are the democratic countries that are allies of ours and countries that are not allies of ours and are authoritarian and invade their neighbors. And I think that's a good thing that we make that distinction because there's a big picture struggle going on. And y- I think to give the benefit of the doubt to the MAGA crowd, right? The Tucker Carlsons of the world and the people who are against funding Ukraine. I think they if you're giving them the benefit of the doubt, I think they believe that it's not America's fight. It's far away. It doesn't really matter for our interests what happens. We shouldn't be involved. We have problems at home, debt, immigration, yada yada yada. But of course, it does matter because we have allies in NATO that you think Putin's going to stop at Ukraine. Maybe he will, right? But if you see Putin's history, what does he do? Putin is not crazy. He's not Kim Jong Un, right? He's a sophisticated guy. And he is not going to throw his country into a nuclear war. He's not going to do that. He's not going to do anything that would lead to him being deposed in Russia. But what he will do is he will push you as far as he thinks that he can go. And he will get away with as much as he thinks he can until the cost gets too high. And you know who else is probably will is like that? Is Xi Jinping in China. And you can bet they're watching because what happens in Ukraine could be foreshadowing of what happens in Taiwan and with China. We know they have ambitions as well. Iran, clearly they have ambitions in the Middle East. These authoritarian governments are not going to necessarily stop if we just kind of leave them alone. And NATO never invaded Russia. this wasn't about necessarily NATO. I- Putin makes the argument that, well, Ukraine is a fake country, basically, as he says, because it was drawn with lines on a map. Well, that's, pretty much every country around the
Yes.
world. What do you think the Middle East? I mean, Iraq is Sunnis and Shias and Kurds, who many of whom hate each other. Do you think they would have just naturally formed their own country? Of course not. They were lines drawn on a map. Africa. Look at the like. Texas was part of Mexico. If Mexico had a really strong army right now, could they be like, well, in the southern part of Texas, there's a lot of people that speak our language. There's a lot of people who have cultural ties to us. We're just going to take the southern part of Texas back. Of course not. That is not how we do things. No matter what your justifications are that Putin comes up with, you either think that's a good idea that he should be able to do that, or you don't. And if you don't, then it's probably a good idea to spend some of our money in the United States, a small amount of what we spend on defense, to help a democratic country fight against him. By the way, most of that money spent actually in the United States. The vast majority of that 60 billion out of the total bill, which was 95 billion, 60 billion dollars for Ukraine. The vast majority of that is spent building new weapon systems, new shells, new missiles in America. We send to Ukraine, we send to Israel as well, what we have in stockpile. Then we replenish that with American workers doing American jobs, building those things in America. So that's kind of, and you mentioned the border. I think Republicans were smart, and I agreed with them 4 5 months ago when they said, "Hey, we will only do this Ukraine aid. We're going to use the leverage. You want this aid for Ukraine and Israel, the Biden administration, fine, but we will only do that if you take care of this major problem we have with our border, because security should include border security. If you want to fight for Ukraine, if you want to help them and help Israel, you should also take care of our own border." I thought that was smart. I agreed with that. Use that political leverage. And they did. And they worked out an agreement. And guess what happened when they came back? The Republicans were like, most of them in the Senate were like, nah, no thanks. Trump doesn't like it. Trump doesn't want it. Even though a lot of them, we all know, if Donald Trump had supported it, they would have voted for it. We know that. It would have passed. It would be law now. But Trump comes out against it, and it tanks it in the Senate. So think about this position. You had a position among Republicans, which I thought was extremely reasonable, which was give us some security on the border, and we'll pass this big aid package to help our allies and friends around the world. They work out a deal. The Border Patrol Union supports it, which is no fan of Joe Biden, and it gets border security, some, not all, not everything you want, for not having to really give up much that you've had to give up in the past on the Republican side in terms of amnesty, path to citizenship, and so on. And Republicans said no. So what are you left with? You're left with just the Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan money. It passed the Senate. It would pass the House if they let it on the floor. It has the majority support of support, but Trump doesn't want it. And so we'll see what happens in the House.
Yeah, and last thing on the whole Putin and Russia deal. And again, I was watching this interview that Tucker did at this summit, and they were, now this is complex, and I don't pretend to be a scholar, but if you go back to when Russia actually wanted to be, we've heard, a part of NATO, and NATO was created to keep the Soviets in check, right? If at any time Russia then wanted to join NATO, and Tucker Carlson makes this point, and I want to say I'm not Mr. Putin apologist or Tucker Carlson apologist, and I'm somebody who I think we should support Ukraine against Russia. I just say that because sometimes you're going to have somebody who's always going to give the pro or the the other side of this. But if the United States potentially under Clinton 25, 30 years ago, whatever it was, did have the chance to welcome Russia into NATO, you would think you've achieved your goal. So this is more big picture. But I think there is something to be said that if we keep pushing NATO to the borders of Russia, they start to get a little squeamish in the same way we did during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we would be the same. Let's be real. We would be the same if a hostile uh, adversary tried to all of a sudden set up shop in Canada or in Central America, right? And I just kind of throw this out there just for a little context. I just think it is interesting. We talked about the history of Russia and how Putin goes back to telling you a story from 800. I do think overall, the fact that kind of look, Russia and the Soviets, they're probably always going to be our enemy. But if we always look at them like that, it's also hard to compromise at all.
Yeah, a couple things about that because I think that's a worthy discussion. So I think, look, I'm no expert on NATO, but I believe part of NATO, getting into NATO, is not just do you support the military alliance. I think it's do you share the values
Hmm.
of democracy? And Russia clearly, no. The answer is unequivocally no. So
Right.
Putin wanted to get into NATO. What would that even mean? I mean, how do you let a country into NATO that has the exact opposite governing system of what NATO represents, which is open societies, democracy, elections? That is not what happens in Russia. Yes, they have elections, but everybody knows they're a sham. If you oppose Putin, you will go to jail or worse. As we've seen over and over and over again, this is not this is not some secret. Everybody knows this. So yeah, like, do I believe that Putin may have thrown out, "Hey, let us into NATO" at one point? Sure, absolutely, I believe that because for him that makes sense, right? But do
Trojan
I think
horse.
that it would right, it would be it would be what would NATO even mean at that point? It would be basically completely meaningless, right? Because part of NATO is to contain the expansionistic tendencies of Russia, which includes expanding their ideology, which is the exact opposite of what NATO stands for. So I think that's Russia joining NATO is someday I would love to see that. Look, I would love it if Russia were a pluralistic democracy and they had open and fair elections and they became part of NATO and we all sang kumbaya and lived together in happiness. That would be incredible, right? That is not the world that we live in, and it's because of Vladimir Putin that we don't live in that world. It's not because of NATO. NATO's never attacked Russia. Let's be honest. I mean, NATO's been around for 70 years. They've not attacked Russia. They're not going to attack Russia. So Putin is paranoid about it. Now, but I do think it is legitimate to say, because as you pointed out with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we did not want an adversarial nation storing weapons close to us. So I can understand why Putin would not want Ukraine to be part of NATO. And I think there is a way to negotiate this, to settle this, where maybe Ukraine has some type of neutral status where they're part of the EU, but they're not part of NATO. But they're not going to agree to that if you also take a huge chunk of their land, which is what Putin wants to do. This war, like most wars, will probably end with a negotiated settlement. That's often what happens in wars, right? You sometimes one side wins and has an overwhelming victory and they basically force their terms on the other side. But a lot of times with wars, one or both sides just get tired of fighting and they make a deal. That's probably what's going to happen. I agree with Tucker Carlson in that regard and Donald Trump. I would like to see a deal too. But that deal is not going to happen on terms that are any way acceptable to Ukraine as long as Putin thinks he has a chance to win militarily. The only way you're ever going to get a good deal is if Putin, again, what I go back to earlier, Putin will push you until the price is too high. And then when the price is too high, he's not crazy, he'll make a deal. And that is what it's going to take. He will have to feel like the pressure is too much, the losses are too much, it's just not worth it. Hey, let's cut a deal. Maybe Ukraine joins the EU but stays out of NATO. Maybe we get to keep a tiny piece of Crimea, but the rest of it goes back to Ukraine. That kind of a deal is probably how this all ends. But you're not going to get to that point unless Putin realizes he cannot win militarily.
Yeah, it's funny when you say Putin's not crazy, and I don't think he's crazy, but in the sense of to me it is crazy to lose however many how many soldiers and people have died, hundreds of thousands on both sides. But
Yeah, we
I do
really
think
don't
it's
know the true answer to that. Neither side is open with their casualty numbers, but it is a massive number for sure.
so yeah, right. So and I just bring this up because when you talk about the word crazy, to me it is crazy to sacrifice that amount of your soldiers for this fight for what I think is going to end up in a settlement, like you said, for a sliver of land. And this is where it comes down to, we're already tired of this war in the country, in our country, and we're funding this war. Let's be real. And that's where, the fight on the Russian side through their propaganda And if they're willing to lose 500,000 soldiers for this sliver of land, you're not going to be able to beat them because, again, the United States is funding this war. We don't have that passion for this. They do in Russia. Like, we have to keep the Ukraine alive in this war, and we're already getting sick of it. And if Vladimir Putin will never surrender and he's willing to lose hundreds of thousands of soldiers for a small portion of land, you're not going to be able to beat him. Now, you might have a settlement, but you're not going to be able to truly win and gain back all that territory.
I agree that, yeah, I mean, look, do I think that it's likely that Ukraine will will be able to regain every ounce of territory that they lost? Remember, this started in 2014 when Russia took Crimea. So that was part. Do I think Ukraine will ever get back all of that land? Probably not. But the thing with Russia is even Putin, and the reason I say that he's not crazy, he will protect his own regime at all costs. And he is, even dictators are susceptible to public opinion. And it's hard to know what public opinion is in Russia for many of the obvious reasons we talked about. But there are reports that there are widows and mothers leading protests against the regime. And Putin did not, he had a draft a little more than a year ago. He did not do that again yet. And there's a reason he didn't do it again. It's not because he's not losing soldiers. He is. If it were up to him, I'm sure he would like to mobilize, hundreds of thousands of more people. Because as you said, to him, the people dying are expendable. He doesn't care about that. But what he does care about is public opinion turning on him. And that could happen if the war goes on long enough, if enough people die, if he has to do another draft. And that is what I say when I say Putin isn't crazy. He doesn't care about the things that you and I would care about, or that the American government will care about, like losing our people. He doesn't care about that. But what he does care about is losing public support, because even dictators need public support. And if he felt like he was getting to the point where he was losing that support and the war effort just wasn't worth it anymore, and he couldn't achieve his objective, because remember, his first objective, we all know, was to remove Zelensky one way or another, either by killing him or forcing him to flee, and installing some type of puppet government like they have in Belarus. That's what was his first goal. That didn't happen. Ukraine was strong enough. Ukraine pushed back enough. Ukraine had enough support from the United States and Europe that he had to abandon that. So now his fallback is, well, that's okay. We just don't want you in NATO, and we want to take about 30% of your country for our own, right? And so if he thinks he can get that, he will keep going. But when the price for that becomes too high, then I think there will be a chance to make a deal and to make some type of, because it's not, we act like the United States, and part of this, because we have like this player one syndrome, or what's it called? First person syndrome, like that we think everything's about the United States. Russia gets a vote and Ukraine gets a vote, because they're the two sides fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And this will not end until they both agree to something that is acceptable to them.